Howdy guys, and welcome back to the channel. After playing almost 80 hours across my first, Soul Level 1, and footage playthroughs of Dark Souls 1, I feel like I'm now qualified to make my very own boss ranking video. I've been itching to make one for a while now, and I'm excited to dive straight into it. By now it should be no secret that I adore Dark Souls 1. How could I not? But how do the boss fights fare in this opinion? Is it the mixed bag I thought it was when I made my retrospective video, or is it better than I remember? Let's find out. These rankings will be based on my opinion of these fights from my playthroughs, but I will do my best to make sure that they are informed by objective observations. You may or may not agree with what I have to say, so please feel free to tell me your thoughts on these bosses and how you would rank them in the comments. If you enjoy the video, consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it, and if you choose to do so, you might even get a cookie. What's that? Oh, okay, thank you, Chetley. On the advice of my legal counsel, I retract my previous statement as I do not know how to bake. With that legal embarrassment out of the way, let's get to the ranking. These bosses will be grouped into tiers based on how I view their respective traits and certain factors that they have in common. From there, the rankings within the tiers will reflect my preference for their movesets, atmosphere, and general design. Starting off our list in last place and in its own tier, you all saw this coming, we have the Bed of Chaos. Bed of Chaos is a bit of an oddball here. Although it's given a health bar and bears a Lord Soul, I have a hard time using the word fight for this entry. It's meant to be a puzzle boss with light platforming sprinkled in to spice it up. However, I feel that these design qualities just don't work in tandem to make an interesting or even dynamic boss for me. The player is meant to hit 2 shackles on each side of the boss before jumping onto a platform below the arena to enter inside the tree and hit a bug that controls the creature. The fight here is literally 3 hits, with only the third and final one actually meant to damage the boss. On top of that, as you progress through the boss's phases, the arena crumbles, creating incentivized paths in order for the player to memorize and ultimately traverse and progress through the boss. The game does the player a solid by saving the progression of the phases after you die, so it's at least not as annoying as it could have been. The more I think of Bed of Chaos, I begin to view this more as a level rather than an actual fight. And in that context, sure it's more bearable, but this comes off as more of an indictment rather than a compliment. Despite these critiques, there are ardent defenders of Bed of Chaos out there. In fact, the viewer took the time to message me their defense of this boss by stating that it has a consistent pattern and a singular path that makes progressing through the boss repeatable. And after testing this for myself, this is true, and these arguments are valid. However, I don't find these pieces of evidence sufficient to reconcile my problems with the boss. Just because Bed of Chaos can be made trivial with an optimized path does not make it a good fight. There's no back and forth combat here, nor are there interesting series of attacks that are satisfying to dodge and punish. At the end of the day, Bed of Chaos is unable to reconcile its fundamental flaw in my eyes. It's just not a fight. Starting off our next tier, which is characterized by severe flaws that hold these bosses back, we have the Centipede Demon. After progressing through the demon ruins and defeating Demon Fire Sage, the player is greeted with a lake of lava, and standing at its center is a red abomination of nature. The Centipede Demon is just an odd entry from me, with the arena drawing the most ire. It's almost entirely lava, which, if the player were to try and traverse, is incredibly punishing. This disincentivizes the player from fighting the boss in the lava, instead sticking to the outer edges where safe land is scarce. Then, you have to wait for what feels like eternity for the boss to waddle over, perform a roundhouse, and begin fighting you on land. After defeating the boss, the player receives the orange Charred Ring, which lowers lava damage to a tick effect, which allows players to traverse the landscape more effectively. If the player had access to this item beforehand, this would ultimately elevate the arena to possibly be something special. You can choose to fight the boss in either the lava or dry land, with a trade-off of mobility for health ticking. Not to mention, who wouldn't want to feel like a badass out in the lava fighting a demon? This also comes into play when factoring in the boss's moveset. It feels like it was designed for a larger space for the player to better dodge and position. It has a series of head lunges, slams, and grabs, but this set doesn't lend itself well for the sliver of land that most players malign themselves to. On top of that, visually this boss is a damn near incomprehensible orange blob of hitboxes. In total, this just does not feel like a fight that was ready for final release and required some serious redesigns. In our 24th spot, we have the hated, though loathsome, Capra Demon. Despite all the hate that it gets, I feel like this fight had decent early game boss potential. After fighting through the lower Undeadburg with its narrow streets, the player is introduced to a claustrophobic boss arena and a punishing lunge move from the Capra Demon. Honestly, props. Great introduction. The Capra Demon itself has an admittedly simple moveset, but it balances aggression with clear and telegraphed attack windows and damage output. But then we're given Miyazaki's ultimate fuck you, dogs. The inclusion of 2 dogs drastically changes this entire encounter. I understand and actually agree with the arena design if it was just the Capra Demon, but the dogs turn this into a dash to the stairs and an outcropping in order to kill them and then fight the actual boss. It ruins the introduction entirely, actively ruins the claustrophobic nature of the arena, and is just straight up not a good time. If the dogs were excluded from this fight, or if the arena was bigger with their inclusion, this would be a far more tolerable experience. I feel that the Capra Demon is a decent fight that is buried beneath 2 external design choices that are diametrically opposed, which leaves this fight to be as hated as it is. Don't worry though, bro. From one Capra to another, it's nothing personal. Up next in my 23rd spot is my personal biggest letdown in the entire game. It's Gravelord Nito. After seeing the opening cinematic of the game, I was most intrigued by Nito's design and lore. He looked to be a disease and toxin-inducing melee fight that had great potential. To be fair, his moveset is passable with a variety of swings and strikes that inflict decent damage, a ranged attack that requires precise dodge timing, and a punishing AoE with a cool visual effect. So imagine my dismay when I get to the boss room just to find that it's a gank fight with his skeleton cronies after taking force fall damage. Now don't get me wrong, gank fights are not necessarily a bad feature. In fact, we'll see a handful of them later on in my rankings. However, its implementation here feels cheap and actively destructive to arena design philosophies that I find sacred. Not all of the gank skeletons are aggroed off the rip, with 3 big ones in the back half of the arena. With this knowledge, the player is disincentivized from utilizing the entire space, not due to environmental factors, but rather because it's easier to just deal with 3 skeletons. Imagine what could have been done here with the center column in order to fight Nito. It would open up mobility, positioning, and strategy that could have offered depth to the fight. Granted, players can use a divine weapon to prevent the skeletons from respawning, but this just feels rather shallow. I feel that a better implementation of the skeletons could have seen a phase 2 where Nito summons them en masse while taking a more passive role in the fight, giving the player the option to either clear out the skeletons or bum rush them. This would separate the fight into 2 distinct phases, directly show Nito's power, and give a fair window to address the skeletons. To be clear, I would still prefer their exclusion entirely, but I'm just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. Don't get me wrong, people will always find certain types of challenges enjoyable and fun, but this fight just doesn't provide that for me. Ultimately, Nito is the definition of wasted potential in my eyes, and is a real letdown with the hype I gave him. Rounding out this tier, we have what is, in my opinion, the most boring fight in the game, the Moonlight Butterfly. After traversing through the Darkroot Garden, the player traverses the fog and is greeted by a tranquil and surreal visual sight. Yeah, that's where all the praise ends for me. Its moveset is not bad, as it's a series of ranged magic attacks that pummel the player if they're not used to these kind of projectiles. However, this is where the fight breaks for me. As a melee player, this fight is the worst, as Moonlight Butterfly is basically unhittable until it comes down to rest. There, you can rail into it before it builds up and performs an AoE attack that transitions to the next flying phase. And now it's back to dodging and watching for 5 minutes. Well, fuck me. Well, let me microwave a burrito while you're having fun up there. And this is ultimately what makes me rank this boss so low and in the severely flawed tier. It's just boring. I know damage and ranged characters can inflict damage to the boss while it's in flight, but that's just not my personal playstyle. It may have great visuals and a gorgeous soundtrack, but at the end of the day, the fight's just not up to snuff. Hey there, this is Mitch. Mitch wants to conquer the lands between and become Elden Lord. Unfortunately, he doesn't know anything about Soulsborne or have friends to give him tips. Instead, he doesn't realize that he has a club and can't even beat Soldier of Godric. To be fair, he is a tough boss. And worst of all,
you are maidenless.
Don't be like Maidenless Mitch. To get tips, tricks, and guides from a vibrant Soulsborne community, join my Discord server. Here you can talk to me, other members, share memes, have access to Chetley themed emojis, and much more. With all of these resources and connections, you'll never be maidenless again. I'd like to give special thanks to Axion for helping design and create this server. He volunteered to do the heavy lifting, and I couldn't have done it without him. Link in the description below. Now, back to the video. We're now entering the inoffensive category. These are bosses that I find to be, well, inoffensive. They have some strengths and flaws, but I don't generally hold them in a negative light. More so that I don't really get invested in fighting them. With that criteria set, starting off this tier in 21st place, we have Ceaseless Discharge. As the first boss accessible in the Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith area, Ceaseless Discharge is a behemoth that's visible from across the map. However, his fight fails to reach his towering physique. When you enter his boss arena, he's not aggroed off the rip. He only becomes aggressive once the player loots his sister's body. Jesus, now that I read that sentence, I feel like a fucking monster. The dude was just vibing there until we desecrated his family's corpse. I don't have any siblings, but fuck, I'd throw hands too if I were him. But that aside, once he aggroes, the fight really isn't all that spectacular. Due to his staggering size and location, it feels more like an on-rails boss where you wait for him to strike and then attack his conveniently well-placed hand. He has one pretty surprising fire attack that caught me off guard, but it's nothing special. In short, you're better off abusing his animation where he jumps to the fog wall and then strike at him until he falls and dies. At least we put the poor bastard out of his misery. In 20th place, we have the man, the myth, the meme, Pinwheel. After traversing the catacombs and surviving Hamster Wheel Alley, the player is greeted by a visually and atmospherically fantastic intro. Pinwheel's lore is actually quite interesting. After the death of his loved ones, he dedicated his life to studying necromancy, only to be corrupted and combined with the corpses of his family. The vibes alone promise an interesting fight, only to be greeted by a single fire moveset and a shallow health pool. However, the fight does have an interesting gimmick where Pinwheel summons numerous clones that admittedly threw me off on my first attempt. However, its effect is heavily limited by the fact that the player's damage output is likely finalized and optimized for the endgame. I feel that if he had a larger health pool or was positioned earlier in the game, this would be better or at least a longer fight. There's a reason Pinwheel is considered a meme, but he'll always have a soft spot in my heart. Coming in at our 19th slot, we have Seath the Scaleless. Oh, Seath, where do I even begin? You first find Seath chilling at the top of the Duke's archives. Okay, seriously, how the fuck did he get there? Is there a door that just opens for him to fly in? Did they build that section around him? Do they use a crane? I need answers, FromSoft. Here, you can't damage him and are given a scripted death in order to progress the level. Not my favorite feature, but I can accept it. After breaking out of academic prison and traversing the Crystal Cave, you find Seath the Dankless gliding down to protect his immortality crystal, beginning the fight proper. You can't damage him off the rip. Instead, you need to run to the other side of the room and destroy the crystal. I find this phase of the fight to be rather tedious, especially considering that it respawns with each attempt. I would prefer if on subsequent attempts, Seath is tending to it when you enter the room attempting to repair it. If the player takes some time between attempts, the crystal will be repaired and you'd have to destroy it again. This is a bit of a nitpick, and it's really not an issue, just a lore and interactive flair that I think would add to the immersion. The fight itself is pretty standard and on rails. Seath has a series of lasers, crystal AoEs that inflict curse buildup, and flailing hentai tentacles. Honestly, I've died to the tentacles the most. The player can take out Seath pretty easily by getting up in his front armpits and smacking away. And yes, this boss has magic resistance. So, melee supremacy! The thing about Seath the Maidenless for me is that during my subsequent playthroughs, I view him as much less of a challenge and more of a chore. Just another checklist item in the latter half of the game, which is more than I can say for some of his in-game counterparts. Following Seath in our number 18th spot, we have Sunlord Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn is an optional boss that the player can access after assassinating a Twitch e-girl and descending into the Darkmoon Tomb and traversing the newly placed fog wall. Here, if the player is not prepared for high damage ranged spells, for the first time in history, a Chwink will be doing the railing. The gimmick of this fight is to dodge his 2 spell attacks and his flurry of arrows upon your approach. If you can survive this onslaught and get up close, the player is given a short attack window to flail into him before he teleports away and resets the fight to square one. Essentially, the arena is a seemingly infinite hallway. I feel that Gwendolyn has a similar design to the Moonlight Butterfly, but is done in a more engaging fashion. This is because the action of dodging his attacks requires the player to actively approach the boss instead of waiting for him to rest. Although they perform the same function of dodging ranged attacks without much opportunity to inflict damage, I view this to be a more stimulating design. Where this boss falls short for me is a shallow health pool and limited number of attacks. A solid design, but I feel like there's a little flair missing that could have made the fight more appealing to me. And yes, I am aware that you can hypothetically draw out the fight long enough to reach the very end of the arena, but that's too much time for myself or anyone to invest. Unless if you really want to pin him against the wall. In our 17th and 16th spots, and a huge surprise for me as I had much disdain for these bosses in my initial playthrough, we have the Demon Fire Sage and Stray Demon. They're basically the same fight. After fighting through the demon ruins, the player traverses through a fog wall and is greeted by this large orange creature. Demon Fire Sage has an interesting AoE that when you first fight him is not all that intuitive. Add that to an overhead strike that has a longer reach than expected, and you have a rather flummoxed experience. After about 3 to 5 tries, I was able to get the moveset down and defeat him rather easily. However, I find this fight to be pretty limited by the construction of the arena. The long and narrow passage combined with the roots that can clip you provide a strangely uncomfortable positioning experience. Based on your positioning when Fire Sage uses his AoE, you may find it impossible to escape. This is exacerbated when you or the boss are pinned against a wall. On top of that, the reach of his overhead strike makes it where there isn't a reliable or seemingly manageable place to engage from. Not to say that discomfort can't provide a rewarding challenge, because there are multiple fights later on that I find uncomfortable but incredibly fun. I just feel that this fight doesn't hit that sweet spot for me. As far as the Stray Demon goes, it's the same fight, just in a better arena, except for the force fall damage. Now why was I so upset by these bosses? Because they're blatant reskins of a boss that I have higher up. Coming in at my number 15 spot and capping off the inoffensive category, we have the ruler of the definitely peaceful, certainly not violent world, Crossbreed Priscilla. As the conclusion of the optional level of the painted world of Ariamis, Crossbreed Priscilla does not initially fight the player upon entering the fog wall. Instead, she offers an ultimatum: leave the world or fight. Seeing that you're an ethical person, you would leave, right? Fuck that. After the player lands a few hits on her, Priscilla turns invisible, and this is where the fun begins. You have to look at the snow to see her footprints in order to locate her and land subsequent hits. If not, the player is railed by her scythe that builds up bleed. If you aren't careful, you can find yourself walking back to the fog wall in the blink of an eye. I think it's a pretty solid fight overall. Not much to really say here, as I think Priscilla earns the top spot of the inoffensive tier with an interesting gimmick. Starting off the good tier at our 14th spot, we have the Asylum Demon. I know, I'm kinda shocked I put him up this high too. After ascending from your cell in the undead asylum at the start of the game, the player gets jumped by this round disgrace of nature. However, at this point, the player has not gotten their weapon and is encouraged not to engage. I mean, you could. If you have the patience to sit there and deal 2 damage for 3 hours, then by all means, go for it. But if you're a sane person, you will eventually see the wide open door to explore the rest of the asylum and go there. After collecting your gear, the player can loop around the map and get to an elevated position to perform a plunge attack that takes out the boss's health. From there, it's a simple moveset with a series of swipes, overheads, and a Lizzo slam. But the genius of this fight to encourage observation and implement an interesting, if often underutilized mechanic, offers a straightforward challenge to new players. He's just really solid, and I can't find a flaw in him. It's a great all-around way to start an amazing adventure. At lucky number 13, we have Great Grey Wolf Sif. In order to enter the Abyss to fight a story boss, the player must acquire the Covenant of Artorias ring. To do so, the player has to visit the grave of Artorias and commit an act of grave robbery. However, our illegal endeavors are stopped short by a giant wolf who, in the past, was Artorias' pet and right-hand dog. In order to put your foolish ambitions to rest, Sif takes up his master's sword and shows that he's got that dog in him. With a series of spin attacks, swipes, and jumps, Sif defends Artorias' grave. However, the moveset isn't really all that demanding. The swipes can be rather simple to dodge through, and honestly, Sif can be reduced to a leg boss. The phenomenon where a player imprisons himself between the boss's legs. There's a your mom joke buried here somewhere, but honestly I'm not feeling inspired enough right now. Despite having that minor flaw, I rank him ahead of Asylum Demon for lore purposes, aesthetic, and do I really need to explain myself? It's a wolf swinging around a fucking sword in its mouth. You can't get any more badass than that. In the 12th spot on my ranking, we have the Gaping Dragon. Placed at the end of the depths, the player enters the massive boss arena expecting something big, but not whatever this is. After the amazing entrance that establishes an out-of-body presentation, I mean seriously, look at that visual design, it's perfect. The Gaping Dragon begins the fight. It has a charge attack, a Lizzo slam, a tail swipe, some stomps, and a toe-curling vomit AoE. Each of these attacks can do massive damage to the player and offer a fairly nice visual spectacle. Additionally, the fight has some dynamism with the surrounding level. If you don't kill the channeler, it can buff the boss and fire ranged spells to make your life a living hell. I think these are insanely good positives to speak for the fight. However, it does have one drawback for me. Its hitboxes do tend to be inconsistent with its attacks and when receiving damage, which prove to be problematic at times. Overall, the Gaping Dragon is an excellent way to end the depths, which gives it a soft spot in my heart. At number 11, this entry may be fairly controversial. Seeing how important this boss is to the story, the lore, and the encapsulation of Dark Souls themes, I may raise some eyebrows here. In this spot, I have Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. Found in the kiln of the first flame at the end of the game, Gwyn is the final boss, the big kahuna. Everything you've done throughout your journey has led to this fight. With extreme thematic tension, anticipation, and environmental vibes, this is sure to be a fight for the ages. Only for the player to enter the fog wall and be greeted by this. The iconic Plin Plin Plon theme, and a hollowed shadow of a lord. Although the fight is meant to be more thematic, as when the player encounters Gwyn in a standard playthrough, they'll likely be able to melt through his health bar. However, I found my Soul Level 1 run to be a more accurate representation of what he is. Gwyn is an unprecedentedly aggressive fight. Each attack comes out fast, which include a series of swipes, jumps, and stabs. He also has a grab attack, which can catch the player off guard if they don't have the timing down. If you manage to survive any of these hits, good luck finding a gap to heal. He has gap closers and a series of high damage swipes which can put your foolish ambitions to rest. Although you can turn this fight into a cakewalk with parry cheese, I struggled to get his timings down during my Soul Level 1 run. This led to me having to play the fight straight and learn his timings. Although it was a short fight due to my damage output, the series of dodges, positioning, and the occasional parry made it surprisingly satisfying to master. Overall, this is a solid fight with great themes and a boss that is elevated by his lore. Despite his strengths, I don't think he brings enough pizzazz to the table, which ultimately makes him fall short of my top 10. Starting off my top 10 is a fight that I have a love-hate relationship with. This is a fight that I thought was too easy when I first played and was aggressively unfair during my Soul Level 1 run. However, with time, reflection, and an objective observation, I find the Four Kings to be a very good fight. After making their way through a gauntlet of a run back to the arena, the player must use one of their ring slots to even access it, putting the player at a disadvantage. A king spawns quite a distance away, and this fight ends up becoming defined by a dice roll of whether or not it will fire out a ranged homing spell, which feels like a precursor to Elden Stars if you ask me. After that, it's some pretty standard combat with a series of large swipes, strikes, and a grab attack. It's a fairly straightforward moveset, but the subtle gimmick is the nuance of damage output depending on how close you are to the boss. The further away you are when you get hit by its sword, the more damage you'll take, so players are incentivized to get up close and hack away. The fight is a test of how much damage the player can inflict in a given time frame, because if you aren't able to take down a given king quickly, another will spawn, further stacking the deck against you. There can be up to 3 kings spawned in the arena at once, which can make things pretty hairy if the RNG gods are not on your side. The strange thing about this fight is that it's never the same on subsequent attempts. Sometimes when multiple kings spawn, they can be pretty chill and back off while you kill their buddy. Other times, they sling out their homing attacks or take swings at you, making the fight really intense and anxiety-inducing. Nothing objectively holds this fight back for me, but I find that the nature of this encounter incentivizes the player to treat this like a min-max DPS challenge. It isn't necessarily bad or anything, I just find the fights I rank ahead of it more compelling, but nothing beats the aesthetic. Up next, in my number 9 spot, we have yet another surprising entry, and that's the Tourist Demon. After fighting through the Undeadburg, the player enters the fog wall to travel along the top of a wall. However, if they're observant, the player will notice some archers above the door and will climb up to take them out. After dispatching them, they continue down the walkway to be surprised by the Tourist Demon, who really knows how to make an entrance. I like your style, man. Can you teach me how to get such a nice vertical? If there's anything that I can say that encapsulates this fight, is that it's simple. And in this case, that's a good thing. The player hasn't had the chance to upgrade their weapon or build much, so a straightforward moveset is appropriate difficulty here. The Taurus Demon has a series of axe swipes, slams, and thrusts that supplement the environment quite well. Being at the top of a narrow walkway, there isn't much room to breathe from side to side, which can, admittedly, lead to some janky camera angles. However, if the player feels like they need some breathing room, they can run straight back to the tower where they killed those archers. Once there, they can do one of two things. Either jump down and execute a plunge attack. Oh wow, it's actually a really cool mechanic when you implement it in an interesting and engaging way. Or let the Taurus Demon jump up and have a circular and more spacious arena. What makes the fight rank this high for me is the variety of different ways you can approach this encounter, regardless of build type. Additionally, the setting and the adequate challenge for its placement in the game allows this fight to just work for me. Up next, in the 8th spot on my list, we have the Iron Golem. After traversing through Sin's funhouse of horrors, the player has one last obstacle to tackle before accessing Inner Londo. The arena has a really great presentation, and the Golem really fits the aesthetics of the fight. He's a big, towering force with an axe, and I love that. He has some basic swipes, stomps, and a grab attack paired with a ranged air swipe that can come out faster than you expected. To attack the Golem, the player must first hit his legs in order to stagger him, make him fall, and deal uninterrupted damage. Fun fact, you can stagger him and make him fall off the arena for a quick victory. Additionally, if the player chooses whether or not to take out the giant with the fireballs at the top of the fortress, the player can get pelted throughout the fight. The Iron Golem is another case of simplicity at its finest. I don't see any particular weak spots with this fight, and he slowly climbed up my list due to this trait. No notes. Rounding out the good tier and starting off the goated run of DLC bosses, we have the Sanctuary Guardian. After warping through time itself, the player is immediately introduced to the DLC with an aggressive, hard-hitting boss that really tests the player's quick decision-making and dodging skills. With a series of flying dives, charges, swipes, tail attacks, kicks, and electric ranged attacks, the Sanctuary Guardian has a rather extensive moveset to work with. Additionally, the unrelenting nature of this boss gives very little room for the player to heal or feel comfortable. On top of that, the Guardian's mobility makes the attack windows for the player quite short. All of these things packaged together offer a decent challenge and an excellent introduction to the DLC. What makes this boss fall short of great for me is just his stage presence and the shallow health pool. Aside from that, you have yourself a really damn good boss. Now we're talking about the big dogs, the great tier of bosses. When evaluating these fights, I'm looking for a combination of uniqueness, pressure, pace, and a satisfying moveset. With that criteria set, I'm starting off this tier with the Bell Gargoyles. Once they've cleared through the undead parish and entered the fog wall at the top of the church, the player will be greeted by a reanimated gargoyle to start the fight. The gargoyle has a decent set of attacks which include wide-reaching axe swipes, an overhead charged attack, a shield punch, a flying tail swipe, a flying dive bomb attack, and a fire breath. I know, he's got quite an arsenal. The real fun begins when you get him to half health, where a second gargoyle spawns in to join the fight. This second gargoyle also has the same set of attacks. However, it typically sticks to spamming its fire attack while the first one sticks to melee. This fight is genius. Its placement early on in the game is a clear test to see if the player can juggle two enemies with complementary movesets. Balance melee with ranged fire attacks, and you've got yourself a great boss fight that engages the player. What adds some depth to this fight is the elevation of the roof beams relative to where the boss is. If you're at the edge of the rooftop, it's slightly lower than the boss, which, depending on certain attacks, will actually go over the player's head, which I think is a nice touch. This fight does not have any downsides in my mind. The way that it places these two just works for me, and it's so satisfying and invigorating to play them each and every time, which is why they've earned my number 6 spot. For my 5th spot on the list, we have the queen herself, Chaos Witch Quelaag. When I first fought this boss, I was absolutely ecstatic. No, not for that reason, you creep. Quelaag's design fits a very interesting mold that no other boss in the game really does. She's a melee-focused enemy with ranged attacks, AoEs, and actively creates an environmental hazard with her lava pools. These force the player to adjust and be mindful of their positioning. Speaking of positioning, it is the biggest factor in this fight. This can be seen by getting up close to avoid her sword swipes, being at her mid-range side to force her stomp attack, or being mindful of her visual telegraph for her punishing AoE. She's got it all. On top of that, she has the best visual design in the entire boss lineup. Okay, seriously, y'all gotta cut it out. I mean, look at this! The spider and the human connection is such an interesting visual spectacle, coupled with her spider nest arena. The fact that her sword swipe leaves a fiery spiderweb trail, I mean, come on! This is awesome. Honestly, her visual design is what gives her the slight edge over the gargoyles for me and makes her more than worthy of my number 5 spot. To round out our great tier, we have a fight that was so close to making it to S tier, but ultimately fell short due to one design oversight. Regardless of its flaw, this fight is an absolute banger and a mainstay for any Soulsborne fanatic. You knew they would be ranked high, I knew they would be ranked high, it's Ornstein and Smo. After progressing through Anor Londo, the player is introduced to the penultimate fight of the base game. This is a 2v1 fight, like the Bell Gargoyles, that tests the player on how well they can juggle two highly complex movesets. However, with two enemies that stick to each other like glue and don't allow you much time to get in attacks unscathed, how can the player even have a prayer at beating these guys? Allow me to introduce you to pillars. The arena has 2 rows of pillars that can be utilized to separate the bosses and create your own opening. But before I can tell you how this works, let's talk about their respective movesets. Smo is the larger, beefier enemy, but he has a simpler moveset. He has some slams, jumps, and hammer swings that deal out punishing damage. He also has a charge that deals a similar effect and serves as a gap closer. Ornstein is a smaller, nimbler fight in this duo. He has a series of slashes, stabs, jumps, and a ranged lightning spell that can be rather punishing if the player isn't prepared. However, he has one attack in his arsenal that allows you to use the pillars to your advantage. The key is to position yourself and kite Smo to charge into a pillar and lock himself into an attack animation. While he's doing that, the player needs to get some distance from the pair and proc Ornstein to use his gap-closing dash attack to give space and time for you to attack him. Although this is a great design choice, it has a singular flaw that can be quite frustrating. You see, these two have a tendency to get stuck on textures, which makes sense if the player is to separate them. However, the problem is when it happens to Ornstein during his aforementioned dash. If he gets caught on a texture, which he will, it burns time from his scripted animation. Once he breaks free from the obstacle, he practically teleports to the player and his attack is essentially undodgeable. As bad as this coding oversight is, it's fairly tolerable. Once you dispatch one of the two, typically Ornstein, the fight transitions to phase 2, which sees the survivor buff to full health and increase in size and damage. From there, in this case Smo, gains lightning damage and adds an additional move to his arsenal, the Lizzo Butt Slam, which can be surprisingly punishing. As long as you're cautious about your spacing and stay disciplined in your attack timing, you can properly dispatch of Smo and surmount the base game's biggest test of skill. I mean, what else can I say about this fight that hasn't already been said? It's the encapsulation of great and is the reason why games like Dark Souls are as memorable as they are. Although it falls short of S tier for me, it never fails to keep me on the edge of my seat. Alright, we're in the S tier now. The GOATs, the absolute legends. If you've been paying close attention, yes, the last 3 bosses left on my list are all from the DLC. It's that damn good. All 3 of these bosses can be rearranged on any given day, and they may change even more after I play this game on more playthroughs. But with that being said, we're going to start off this tier with the tone setter, the legend, the memer, and the absolute dad. We have Manus, Father of the Abyss. At the end of the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, Manus is the final boss of this area. And oh boy, does he send it out on a high note. When I say that Manus has it all, I mean it. He has a vast and countless array of swipes, short, medium, and ranged melee attacks, jump slams, ranged spell attacks, a ranged spell ring that encloses the player, and the infamous Wombo combo. On top of all of these attacks, this guy is fast. He whips out these attacks quick, and it is the ultimate test of the player's reaction time. One false move, and you're down half a health bar. If you mess up the dodge timing or positioning for the Wombo combo, you're stuck for an animation that melts over 3/4 of an upgraded health bar. Precision is the name of this game. This is the only fight in the game that I feel that I did not fully learn. When I beat Manus, it felt more like I had been lucky to survive long enough to inflict the killing blow. I look forward to revisiting this fight in the future in order to truly master it. If I had to give a single note on this fight, it would be the color design in relation to the boss and the environment. It's a really dark arena with a dark boss, which led to me misinterpreting some of his telegraph animations. But this is really more of a nitpick, and not even close to making me consider Manus any lower than 3rd place. Today's runner-up in my Dark Souls 1 boss ranking was an incredibly tough decision. These last 2 could honestly have an equal claim to the number 1 spot. But at the end of the day, I had to reference my first playthrough and my reaction to the respective fights. Ultimately, it came down to which one reminded me why I play these games more than the other. With that being said, my number 2 spot on this ranking goes to Knight Artorias the Abyss Walker. Guys, this fight fucks. I could honestly leave it there and feel justified with my reasoning. But due to academic honesty and this silly little technicality called evidence, I'm obligated to explain. To start, let's talk about presentation. After traversing the Royal Wood, the player enters a giant Colosseum arena to find this. Talk about an entrance. Artorias is one of the only humanoid opponents in the entire game, and my god, does he put on a show. The defining trait to Artorias' fight is pressure. He is constantly pressing up on the player, giving them little room to breathe, let alone heal. He is unrelenting in his pursuit. With a series of gap-closing stabs, slashes, spin attacks, goop slings, and a badass flip slam, Artorias is a certified badass. His only point of respite is when he applies his buff, which gives an uncontested window for the player to inflict damage and stagger him before he can get it off. I mean, look at this! This guy is fighting you with a broken arm. If he was at full capacity, there's no way in hell that you're winning this fight. He's just a goat, but yet one boss stands ahead of him in my mind. What boss could possibly rank ahead of him with all of his great traits? The answer may surprise you. Taking the crown from my favorite boss in Dark Souls is a fight that pushed me to the brink, but pulled me back in a way that reminded me why I love these games. It's Black Dragon Kalameet. As the only optional fight in the DLC, Kalameet stands as an amazing challenge for first-time players. In order to fight Kalameet, there is a bit of an odd process. When the player enters the arena, Kalameet will fly by and pelt them with fire, quickly killing them. The player must then go to Goff, who showcases a 360 no-scope to injure Kalameet out of the sky. Once that's done, the player can fight Kalameet proper. Now restricted to the ground, Kalameet showcases a rather deep moveset. He has a handful of swipes and stomps, a tail slam, multiple ranged fire attacks, a dash and aerial dive bomb, and a visually impressive grab attack that, when it hits you, makes the player take double damage for the rest of the fight. This boss was the first one in over a year to make me audibly rage. I could not for the life of me get his moves down. I kept mistiming the dodge for his initial swipes, I couldn't properly position for his fire and dash attacks, the tail swipe took me out one too many times, and I was just incredibly angsty about the experience. However, after about 7 attempts, it finally clicked. I got his dodge timing down, I could meander through his legs properly, I could roll through his dash, I could tell when he was going to go for his aerial dive and fire attacks with enough time to get out of there. It became a dance. No other fight in the game made me feel this much control and at the mercy of the boss quite like this. I was in a pure, uninterrupted flow state, and when I finally took him down, well, you can take a gander at how I felt. Right, run. Yes! 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 Oh! Oh! That moment right there is what separated Kalameet from Artorias in my mind. It reminded me why I play these games and why I feel that they are the ultimate gaming experience for all those who are willing to give it a chance. And it's an experience that I will never forget. And that's why Black Dragon Kalameet is my favorite boss in Dark Souls 1. So that's my ranking. What did you think of my list? Let me know down in the comments. If you would like to see me do more of these ranking videos, please let me know what topic or game you would like to see me do. Seeing how cool this video was to make despite how long it took, I might enjoy doing another one of these. Maybe even for Dark Souls 2 when I finish it. Let's see how many bosses I would have to rank. Oh dear god.